Thank you all for your practice. Okay. So yesterday, or not yesterday, what am I talking about? Last week, that's the one. Last week I started a series on the Satipatthana Sutta. The Satipatthana is the Buddha's discourse on the four foundations of mindfulness. And last week I gave an overview of each foundation and just a little bit of history on the Satipatthana. And this week we're actually going to start getting into what it says. So, that being said, tonight we're going to talk about the breath. It's something that we all do all the time. We're always breathing. If you're not, there's a problem. But how often are we really conscious and aware of our breath and that we're breathing? Based on the assumption that the average person is healthy, they breathe about 15 breaths per minute, which breaks down to about 21,600 breaths per day. Each one of these breaths is 100% unique. No breath will be like the last one, and it won't be like the one that precedes it. So, I'm pretty conscious of my breath most of the time on a good day. On my best days, I'm right there with it. On my worst days, I'm pretty absent-minded. There's an absence of mindfulness. I effectively fall into the trance of life. I just kind of fall back asleep. And that's easy to do in the world today, especially with most of us are barely just struggling to survive. And mindfulness is a little more difficult for us. I feel like if you're a monastic, it's probably a little easier because you don't have all of this to deal with. But this is really where the practice comes in handy, I think. Of course, I don't know. I've never been a monastic, so I can't really say. They might have it really hard. I know they only get about 4 to 6 hours of sleep at night, and they wake up very early, and they meditate a lot. But that doesn't sound terribly rough to me. But there are parts of the lay life that I do enjoy, and those are not available to the monastic community. So I will likely never know what it is truly like to be a monastic. I can only guess. Just fall asleep. It's like all I do. Sharon Salzberg has that quote that mindfulness is great when we remember to do it. And that's like the most true quote I think I've ever heard in my life. It's a wonderful practice when you remember to do it. And that is why they call it a practice, because we are not going to get it right. Not all the time anyway. Not 100% of the time. Hopefully. Like if I can get like 70%, that would be cool. Even 20% would be great. If I can hit 20% every day, I think I'm doing all right. And it's a practice of training the mind. It's a practice of training the mind to be more present, more in the moment, to be kinder, more compassionate, and ultimately to be free from suffering. And all of those sound pretty good to me, especially the last one. I would really like to be free from suffering. And that's essentially what this practice is about. It is about freedom from suffering. It's said that the Buddha only taught 2 things: suffering and the path that leads to the end of suffering. And so in that, I would like to talk about the path that leads to the end of suffering, namely the Satipatthana Sutta. I would like to talk about where this practice of mindfulness breathing comes from, what the benefits of this practice are, and how we practice it. So this practice, as I said, this practice of mindfulness of breathing is from the Satipatthana Sutta. The Satipatthana is found in what is known as the Majjhima Nikaya. The Majjhima Nikaya is the medium-length discourses of the Buddha. It is in the Pali Canon. The Pali Canon is the text that, if you're a Theravadan Buddhist, that's the book you follow. It's the teachings that are most closely attributed to the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. This is Majjhima Nikaya 10. So Satipatthana, as I said, this is the Buddha's discourse on the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So this is like the original handbook on mindfulness, basically. So that everything you will ever hear about mindfulness, whether it's mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based ethical living, mindfulness-based relapse prevention, anything with mindfulness in it it probably came from the sutta. In fact, it definitely came from this particular sutta. So out of the many volumes that comprise the Pali Canon, the original translation was about 57 pretty big volumes. If you were to look at the original Pali Canon, it's like a bookcase worth of books. I think that this is probably one of the most important discourses in the whole of the Pali Canon, because without mindfulness, the rest of it just doesn't really work. We have to be aware, we have to be present, otherwise the rest of the teachings just kind of fall by the wayside. And it essentially makes this training impossible. And I love this practice because it covers so much ground, which you'll, if you come regularly, you will see over the next couple months, because I'm going to be teasing apart the Satipatthana Sutta for probably several months, just on this one sutta. And though this is the original teaching on mindfulness, mindfulness is actually a fairly new word. There was this word sati, and sati means something more like to recollect or to remember. It has this quality of memory to it. But in the late 1800s, there was a couple of scholars, a husband and wife team, that went to India or Sri Lanka to translate the Pali Canon from the original text. And they saw this word sati and translated it as mindfulness, which was the closest thing that they knew to it. Which, it's not a bad translation, if we're being honest. It's a pretty good translation. Sati being mindfulness, as I said, means to remember. Patana means something like the ground or foundation. So what we're being asked to train in is remembering the ground and remembering that we are here right now in this present moment. There are 4 foundations of mindfulness. The first is mindfulness of body, and that is where this particular teaching is found. This is actually the first part of the first foundation, is mindfulness of breathing. And then that goes from this to the second foundation, which is mindfulness of Vedana or feeling tone, is the hedonic tone, the pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral quality to any experience that we will have. The third foundation is mindfulness of the mind, or mindfulness of what is called chitta. And chitta means something more like heart-mind. Stephen Batchelor actually went as far as to translate chitta as soul. But this is what that is really the attitudinal lens that we wear, that we meet our experience with. And the fourth foundation is what is known as mindfulness of dhammas, which is, it's been translated as categories of experience, qualities of mind, pretty bad translations. Really, I feel like it means the teachings, to be mindful of the teachings of the Buddha. So, as I said, this is the first part of the first foundation, and it is what is known as mindfulness of breathing, or in Pali, anapanasati. Anapana meaning breath, and sati, again, translating to our modern equivalent, mindfulness. So mindfulness of breathing. It is the first practice in the first foundation, and it's probably one of the first practices that you'll learn if you're new to meditation. Generally, the breath is where people start, but don't let that fool you. It's not exactly a beginner's practice. It goes very in depth in this practice, and we'll get into some of that later. But it's where we start because it's an easy anchor. It's the easiest anchor to find. We don't have to look for the breath. We're always breathing. We're always paying attention to something. So with this practice, what we're doing is we're just paying attention to our breath. We don't have to look for it because it's always right here in front of us. I'd like you to just take a moment and just take a mindful breath. That was fairly easy to notice, right? Don't have to go looking for it. It's not a hard one. And that's why this is the first training in the Satipatthana Sutta, because it's the most obvious anchor that we have available to us. And once we master the breath, then we can move on to the body. We can move on to feeling tone and the mind, and then we can get into the dhammas. But tonight, as I said, we are going to be focusing on the breath. And so how do we practice mindfulness of the breath? Well, fortunately, we were left very detailed instructions on how to train in this practice. And that is what the Satipatthana is. It is the original instruction manual on how to practice mindfulness. And if you would like to take out your hand out, we can dig into this sutta. Did you not get one? So at the beginning, when the Buddha was alive, this was an oral tradition. Nothing was written down. The Pali Canon wasn't recorded until about 300 years after the Buddha's death. And the first iteration of that came from Sri Lanka. It was actually written on palm leaves. So all of the suttas, for the most part, are going to begin with, "Thus I have heard." As I said, this is because this was an oral tradition. And we can actually skip over that first part, but you can take these home with you and study this. So we will just move to the first number here, mindfulness of breathing. And how does a monk live contemplating the body in the body? Herein, monks, a monk having gone to the forest, to the foot of a tree or to an empty place, sits down with his legs crossed, keeps his body erect, and his mindfulness alert. And in some translation, this says, placing mindfulness in front of him. So again, we're met with this image of mindfulness in front of us and the breath. So, ever mindful, he breathes in. Mindful, he breathes out. Breathing in a long breath, he knows, I am breathing in a long breath. Breathing out a long breath, he knows, I am breathing out a long breath. Breathing in a short breath, he knows, I am breathing in, and on and on and on. And there's many refrains of this. In fact, in the original text, it goes on many more times than this. The Buddha was very big on repetition. Again, that oral tradition, you had to really drive it home. But I would like you to continue reading it, and we get to a point where he says, thus he trains himself. So we make the switch from knowing to training. So initially there's this understanding that we are understanding to be breathing in. We know that we're breathing in. And then there's a transition between understanding to training. Again, this is a training of the mind. This is a training of how to practice mindfulness. So first he understands and knows what to do. And then by practicing, he trains thus. That makes sense? Okay. It says, I shall breathe in, experiencing the whole body. The whole of this in and out breath. He trains thus. I shall breathe out, experiencing the whole body. And through such training and practicing, he eventually directly experiences what he had. At first only understood by hearing about method in theory. And through the subtleness of this mindfulness of breathing practice within the bodily process, he gradually calms the bodily formations. And the Buddha uses the analogy, and I'm not sure if it's included on here or not. No, it's not. But the Buddha uses the analogy of a turner, like a lathe worker. And he says, just as a skillful turner or turner's apprentice making a long turn knows, I am making a long turn, or making a short turn knows, I am making a short turn. Just so the monk breathing in knows, I am breathing out a long breath. Breathing in a short breath, he knows, I am breathing in a short breath. Breathing out a short breath, he knows, I am breathing out a short breath. So the Buddha was big on analogies. You see them all the time in the Pali Canon, but and this is essentially how we train in this practice of mindfulness of breathing. Observing the breath, noticing whether we're breathing in the short breath, breathing out a short breath, breathing in a long breath, breathing out a long breath. And I like to deepen it a bit with the quality of the air that we breathe and all the little subtle nuances and phenomena that make up the breath, really dissecting the breath, really investigating the breath. We're bringing this quality of investigation and curiosity to the breath as we practice. And this practice gets further elaborated on in the Anapanasati Sutta, or the discourse on mindfulness of breathing, which if you're a Dharma nerd, that's Majjhima Nikaya 118. And in this discourse, the Buddha actually lays out 16 steps that we're to practice when practicing this training of mindfulness of breathing. And it's through the Anapanasati Sutta, and that sutta goes pretty in-depth. It actually covers all of the stages of mindfulness within the instructions, but it's really the first three that are focused on the breath. But you can pretty much see the whole of the Satipatthana within the Anapanasati Sutta as well. And that's one thing that I've noticed about the Pali Canon is you will come across the same suttas over and over and over, and the same trainings over and over and over and over. it's in this discourse, as I said, that he lays out these 16 steps, and I've actually got a bit of the Anapanasati Sutta here, and it says, "Now, how is mindfulness of in and out breathing developed and pursued so as to be of great fruit, of great benefit?" It says, "There is a case where a monk, having gone to the wilderness, to the shade of a tree, or to an empty building, sits down, folding his legs crosswise, holding his body erect, and setting mindfulness in front of him." Again, always mindful he breathes in, always mindful he breathes out. And so we begin with this awareness of the in and out breath. We begin by bringing our attention to the sensation of the breath as it either enters the nostrils or fills the abdomen. Again, you can choose whatever anchor you want for this practice. I personally focus on the nostrils when I'm doing this practice. That's just my own preference. But wherever the breath is felt. So as long as you're feeling the breath, you're doing it right. As long as you're observing the breath and noticing the breath, bringing this quality of awareness to the breath, you are doing this practice correctly. After you are aware of the breath, we become aware of long or short breaths. Again, we observe whether the breath is long or short on the inhalation and the exhalation without trying to control it or manipulate it. This isn't pranayama. We're not doing breath work. We're just simply observing our natural respiration. And then we experience the whole body, expanding our awareness to include the entire body, feeling the breath in the whole body. And again, that's why I said the first 3 stages of these 16 steps are really what cover mindfulness of breathing within the Anapanasati Sutta. And there are 16 steps, and they're a progressive sequence that allows practitioners to develop mindfulness and concentration and insight through observation of the breath. Because the whole point of the practice really is insight into what are known as 3 characteristics: the imperfect, impermanent, impersonal nature of our existence. And so we see this practice in the Satipatthana Sutta. We see it in the Aritta Sutta, which is Samyutta Nikaya 54, where the Buddha is addressing a monk named Aritta. We see it in the Maharahula Vada Sutta, which is Majjhima Nikaya 54, where the Buddha is addressing his son Rahula. And to a greater degree, again, in the Anapanasati Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 118, as well as the Ananda Sutta, which is Samyutta Nikaya 54, where he addresses his attendant and cousin Ananda. And this is where we really start to dig into how important this practice is. This is where we come to the understanding of why this practice is important. And the Buddha spoke of the importance of this practice many, many times in several different suttas. Ajahn Amaro said that mindfulness of the breath is the key to all of the treasures of the Dharma. And it's in the Ananda Sutta, as I mentioned, where we get a bit of insight into how important this practice is in regards to the path of enlightenment and into exactly what Ajahn Amaro was talking about. So at its core, this is a practice of mindfulness. This is sort of the ground floor of our mindfulness, but it's also the direct path to awakening. And in the Ananda Sutta, the Buddha is hanging out with his cousin, and Ananda asks the Buddha, he says, "Is there one quality that when developed and pursued brings 4 qualities to completion? And 4 qualities that when developed and pursued bring 7 qualities to completion? And 7 qualities that when developed and pursued bring 2 qualities to completion?" And the Buddha said, "Yes, Ananda. There is one quality that when developed and pursued brings 4 qualities to the completion. And 4 qualities that when developed and pursued bring 7 qualities to completion. And 7 qualities that when developed and pursued bring 2 qualities to completion." And what is that one quality when developed and pursued brings 4 qualities to completion? And you get how this is going, right? We could sit here all night and do this. But he says, so what is the practice? He says, mindfulness of in and out breathing, when developed and pursued, brings the 4 frames of reference to completion. The 4 frames of reference, when developed and pursued, bring the 7 factors for awakening to completion. And the 7 factors for awakening, when developed and pursued, bring clear knowing and release to completion. And right from the jump, if you look at your sheet here, the wording is a little different on this one, but He says, "This is the only way, monks, for the purification of beings, for the overcoming of sorrow and lamentation, for the destruction of suffering and grief, and for the reaching the right path, for the attainment of nibbana, namely the four foundations of mindfulness." So right out of the gate, we're told that this is the direct path to awakening. This is the only path for the purification of beings, for the overcoming of sorrow and lamentation. So we're talking about awakening here and now, not in another lifetime, but here and now. And our awakening can be found within the breath. It's right here. We don't have to look for it. And that's a pretty good reason to do this practice, I think, that it's the direct path to the purification of beings. That would be a good reason to start. There's also some pretty compelling neuroscience reasons to do it as well. It increases focus and concentration. So, mindfulness involves directing your attention to the sensations of your breath, the rising and falling of the abdomen, the sensations of breath coming in the nostrils. And this practice can help the mind to stay focused. We can train the mind to be more focused, to be more concentrated. We can cultivate this quality of concentration. And regular practice can enhance your ability to sustain your attention and just improve your overall focus in pretty much every aspect of life. And if you're anything like me, that's a big deal, because I was diagnosed as ADHD when I was like 10 or 11 years old. And sometimes it is hard for me to pay attention to some things. Of course, a lot of things are really boring too, and I just don't want to pay attention to them because they're boring. And I think that's a natural response to boring. But this practice does help with that. Because at one point I was having some difficulty in school, mostly because I found it was boring. But I wish I would have known about this practice then. That might have helped. It could have kept me off of the Ritalin they tried to give me. Stress reduction. Engaging in mindfulness of breathing can help reduce stress and promote relaxation. Most of the time. I'm not going to say that it's going to work all the time. It's not a panacea. I wish it was. That would be really cool. We'd probably have way more people here. It would probably be a way more popular practice if it was some amazing panacea that just covered all the bases. But most of the time it will help with stress reduction. It activates the relaxation response, leading to a calmer state of mind and a decrease in stress levels. Just by paying attention to the breath and observing it without judgment, we create a mental space that can allow us to just step back from whatever's happening in that moment. Because the breath happens on its own, we tend to take it for granted a lot of time. We often overlook the fact that we are even breathing. It's until we sit down and really start looking at it that we even think about the breath. I was on the phone with a friend of mine earlier, and he was like, "Hey, you want to go to the gym?" And I'm like, "No, I got to go teach tonight." And he asked me what I was doing it on. And I said, "Mindfulness of breathing." He's like, "I don't think I ever really pay attention to the fact that I'm breathing." I was like, "Exactly. You should come to the class. Why aren't you here?" But yeah, we take it for granted, and it's crucial to being in the present moment. Really observing the breath can help us really stay focused in this present moment. It helps with emotional regulation. Mindfulness of breathing can enhance our emotional regulation by increasing our awareness of our internal experience. We just become more aware of the inner landscape of our emotions. We start to develop a level of emotional intelligence, noticing what is actually happening within the body and the emotions that are happening in correlation with what is going on in the body. By observing the breath, we can become more attuned to our emotions and our thoughts, and again, the bodily sensations as they arise and they pass away. We start seeing some of the cause and effect, like, oh, when I feel this in the body, it presents itself as this emotion, which can be very helpful. Because a lot of times you'll notice that emotions start in the body first. I know it doesn't really seem that way, but the more you pay attention, emotions begin in the body. In fact, this is the emotional body. This is just thoughts. This heightened level of awareness can actually help us to respond to our challenging emotions with a little bit of equanimity rather than just reacting. When we slow down, we get the chance to respond rather than react. then we have some choices. And it's nice having choices. It's nice being able to choose what your response is going to be rather than just having a knee-jerk reaction to a stressful moment. When we train our mind to be aware of the breath, we give ourselves a reference point, so to speak, and a place to come back to. So the breath ends up being kind of a sanctuary or a refuge in that sense that we can always return to when things get a little crazy. Like I said, it's not going to work all the time. It's not that efficient. Not for me. Maybe if I did go become a monk, I would be that efficient at it, but I'm not. The Buddha said that this concentration through mindfulness of breathing, when developed and practiced much, is both peaceful and sublime. It is an unadulterated, blissful abiding, and it banishes at once and stills evil, unprofitable thoughts as soon as they arise. And that sounds pretty awesome. I wish I could banish unprofitable thoughts as soon as they arise with any consistency, but I cannot. I'm pretty good on my best days. On my best days, I'm good at it. On my worst days, I'm not. It also helps to establish a mind and body connection. By just paying attention to the breath, we can develop a healthier relationship with the body. We actually begin to notice the body. I don't know how much this is true in the East, but I know in the West, a lot of us really live up here. We're very, very in this headspace, and we just kind of forget this exists most of the time unless something's really going wrong, and then we're like, oh, there's something wrong. But a lot of times, like how often are we really mindful of the body in any given moment? And there's a bunch of other ones I wrote down here that we could go over, but I don't think that's really even necessary. Except for improved well-being. I think that's pretty necessary. This practice promotes improved well-being. Just overall. An overall better sense of well-being. It can contribute to a greater sense of inner calm, contentment, and dare I say, happiness at times. Happiness is a high bar, though. I don't concern myself with happiness so much. I'm more into the contentment. I don't feel like we're supposed to be happy all the time. And anybody who tells you you're supposed to be happy all the time is probably trying to sell you something. Just by grounding yourself in the present moment, you can experience life more fully and really appreciate some of the simple joys. Just taking a look around. I know for me, it's really easy to get caught up in the daily ins and outs and the vicissitudes of life and not be mindful. But when I stop and I just look around and I look at the trees and I look at the clouds, it is peace. Even in the midst of chaos, it's peace. If we just slow down enough to appreciate the moment for what it is. We bring ourselves back to this present moment because the present moment is all we ever have. The past is gone. It's never going to be here again. The future never, ever comes. It's always right. And so with mindfulness, we can train ourselves to be right here, right now, fully immersed in the present moment, without judgment. And when we're fully in the present moment, life is much more manageable. We can stop dwelling on the past and stop worrying about the future. And we can learn to just be. Thich Nhat Hanh said that when the mind is scattered, it is in the breath that we bring it back. And I would have to agree. And so I talked a little bit about what this practice is and where it comes from, a bit about how to practice and why we practice. And so now let's do some more practice. And we'll do some more mindfulness of breathing. Again, just finding a posture that's upright and supportive to allow you to sit comfortably for the next 20 minutes. Just allowing the eyes to close, bringing your awareness inward. Just coming back to your anchor of the breath. And the meditation will begin and end with the bow. So again, just scanning the body and softening any points of tension that are felt. Scanning from the top of the head to the tips of the toes. Just relaxing and breathing into any points of tension. Coming back to the anchor of the breath. And breathing in, knowing that you're breathing in. And breathing out, knowing that you're breathing out. Just training the mind come back to the breath. This practice is effectively breaking the addiction to the thinking mind. Each time the mind wanders, coming back to the anchor of the breath. Observing whether you're breathing in a short breath and breathing out a short breath. Breathing in a long breath, breathing out a long breath. Now I invite you to expand your awareness to include the entire body, feeling the breath as it flows through you. Relaxing the body and releasing any tension or tightness that you may be holding. We can cultivate a certain amount of joy just appreciating the fact that we are breathing. Deepening this sense of contentment and well-being with each breath. Just observing the thoughts, the emotions, the mental states that all arise and pass away while maintaining this focus on the breath. Just allowing any disturbances or distractions to settle and dissolve. Gently returning your attention to the breath. Each time the mind wanders, simply returning to the breath. I invite you to observe the quality and the state of your mind as you meditate. Just noting any changes or fluctuations. As we observe the mind, we can begin to cultivate positive mental states such as gratitude, kindness, compassion, all serving to uplift the mind. And again, just deepening our concentration by just gently coming back to the breath when the mind wanders. As we observe the breath, we can also cultivate a sense of detachment. Just letting go of any clinging or any aversion that may be present. We observe the phenomena of the breath and the mind and the internal landscape. We begin to gain insight into the impermanent nature of all phenomena. The arising and passing away of the breath. The constantly fluctuating and changing inner landscape of thoughts and emotions. The constantly changing state of the body. We can also observe the dissolution of distractions and mental formations as we maintain mindfulness of the breath. We can observe moments of stillness and cessation, where the breath may temporarily pause or become very subtle, and the breath becomes almost imperceptible. from this place that we begin to let go and surrender to the present moment. Just relinquishing any grasping, any striving. Nowhere to go, nothing to do, no one that you have to be. Just letting go as we arrive into the present moment. Just practice for these next few moments in silence. Thank you all for your practice.